Agents. We will be starting in about 5 minutes time. Yeah, please, yeah, feel free to get seated and please come forward. Yeah, yeah. Please. Don't go for the song.
Okay.
Cool.
No problem at all.
Lot meeting.
Possible to turn down the light for a little bit for the video.
Just for the thing. Oh,
I mean, it is very bright and I think the PowerPoint is a little bit hard. We can at least serve it yeah, that's great, that's great. Awesome.
You want it? But
Yeah, I think that's great. We're still the PowerPoint a little more visible, otherwise it kind of get more fast.
I think already live stream so there are others. So.
Great, yeah.
Wilson, hi, nice to meet you.
It's great to meet you.
Yeah.
No worries.
Hello, good afternoon. Can you all hear me? I mean. Yeah, just in case, can you all hear me from the back? All good. Okay. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. So thank you for joining us today. My name is QY Chu. I'm an assistant professor in environmental humanities and the Chinese program of Nanyang Technological University. It is my great pleasure, and on behalf of the School of Humanities and the Environmental Humanities Research Cluster at NTU, to welcome you all to this public lecture. And as a part of our school's distinguished lecture in the Humanities series, we are especially delighted to have Professor Ursula Heise from UCLA in our to be in our school. Professor Heise is a leading scholar in environmental humanities, whose works have been highly influential in shaping environmental humanities and also conversations in environmental literature, comparative literature, multi-species studies, etc. But before we begin, may I first invite our Dean, Professor John Wilson, Dean of College of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences, to offer an opening review.
It's wonderful to have Professor Heise with us. And I just, before hearing your talk, which we're very much looking forward to, I wanted to kind of quickly talk about some of the things that we at NTU in the College of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences, but maybe beyond, kind of are doing in the sort of area of, I suppose, environmental humanities and beyond. Mainly, I'm going to be talking about the amazing work that QY is doing. So, but not just QY, but many other people. So we have, I mean, NTU for a long time has been somewhere that's been, I guess, quite a kind of an innovative centre when thinking about environmentalism. We have a campus that sort of wins environmental awards, kind of buildings that you get get awards for kind of sustainability and so on. Across the university, outside of the College of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences, there's kind of people working to mitigate, if you like, to engage with do what one can in the context of climate crisis, in the context of the sort of crises of sustainability that exist across the world, whether that's really thinking about renewables, whether it's thinking about reducing electricity emissions, emissions from electricity use, kind of sustainable forms of AI, using orange peel to kind of recycle batteries, etc., etc. There's an incredible range of stuff being done by scientists. But that's, I guess, not what we're here to talk about tonight. There is also a range of work being done, sort of in the kind of relationship between, I suppose, humans, whatever we are, kind of, and the environment in various ways. And I wanted to kind of flag a few things. We have an environmental humanities minor, we have a kind of sustainability minor, and I think the real, one of the strengths of education at NTU is the possibility of students to combine kind of sort of these kind of interdisciplinary subject areas with, if you like, their traditional curriculum. So those are often very sort of students. We have the Environmental Humanities Cluster, which was mentioned, which is a kind of which is hosting this event, and which is kind of a leading force, which many of you obviously don't need to tell you about. You need to tell me about it, within the School of Humanities, but actually beyond the College of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences. We are due shortly to be launching again, many of you involved in this, Max Planck Centre for Biocultural Worlding, which will be a collaboration between the Centre for Contemporary Arts at NTU and the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, looking about the relationship between art, culture, and environmental change, and particularly thinking about two things. One of them is how can how do you think quite radically about the kind of sort of the way we produce knowledge in the context of environmental change? So thinking beyond kind of books, articles, papers, but thinking about I guess local community forms of knowledge and how we engage with kind of or out, kind of locally or whoever kind of local indigenous, etc. systems of knowledge, and how we curates, preserves, etc. Sort of a knowledge system, forms of knowledge, forms of cultural practice that are being threatened by environmental change. And the other element of that project is going to be about the law and thinking about what kind of legal regimes you want to have around the culture. So that's one thing that's very exciting that's going on. We have, and I'm going to shut up in a second. we have an ongoing set of collaborations that are a bit less institutionally tangible, but I think hopefully will take greater institutional form with the Asian School of the Environment, which is part of the College of Science, but has social scientists and humanities people as well as scientists. A really productive relationship there with volcanologists, for example. So, and we are making new appointments in fields, environmental humanities fields, for want of a better word, kind of at quite a fast pace. There will be new colleagues coming in August, January, etc., who will join those of us currently working in this field to be building something. And I don't know quite what form. At the moment, there's an environmental humanities trust, which is fantastic, but I don't. The future is open in terms of forms that this kind of work might. Okay, maybe Ursula can give us some advice and kind of script and help us with that. But my job is just to do the sales pitch for interview, and there's a lot going on. It's very exciting, and I'm going to come back to QI, and we really look forward to the major opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Allow me to thank Dean again for its ongoing support for all these interdisciplinary environmental collaborations and also initiatives that we are developing. And I hope this is one of the first, but not definitely. There will be many more similar kind of talks and activities that we'll be having, and this dialogue can go on. So. Many of us have already had a truly stimulating day yesterday with Professor Ursula Heise through her insightful talks on environmental futures, narratives of environmental futures, and talk about literature about the apocalypse, and also introducing us to new ideas of survivals and utopia. And then in addition to that, it is also a real honor to be introducing Professor Heise again for this public lecture. So Professor Heise is a distinguished professor in the Department of English and the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability at UCLA, and a co-founder of the Laboratory for Environmental Narrative Strategies. She has also authored multiple books, just to highlight two of them, that has been highly influential to the scholars of environmental humanities, including myself. In a Sense of Place and Sense of Planet, the Environmental Imagination of the Global, published in 2008, offers a foundational framework for thinking about environmental issues beyond a global and local dichotomy. And then in 2016, Imagining Extinction, the Cultural Meanings of the Endangered Species, which received the book prize from the British Society for Literature and Science, enlightened us on how the discussions in biodiversity, conservation, and justice can be examined in a range of multi-species narratives. She is currently also working on a new book titled Reclaiming Ecotopia, Speculative Fiction and Environmental Futures. In addition to that, Professor Heise also co-edited numerous important volumes, including the Routledge Handbook to the Environmental Humanities, The Future of Comparative Literature, and Environment and Narrative in Vietnam, as well as more recently, Unsettling Extinction, Global Challenges in the Environmental Humanities, which is coming out in May 2026. And then in today's lecture, Multi-Species Justice and Narrative, Professor Heise will also introduce us to different forms of multi-species narratives to examine how we can conceptualize justice in different forms of multi-species narratives, and also to examine how we can conceptualize justice beyond the humans and towards the animals and the broader, more than human worlds. So without further ado, please allow me to welcome Professor Ursula.
All right, thank you so much, QY. Thank you, Dean Wilson. Thank you, Professor Q, for these really generous and kind introductions. It's a great pleasure to be here and to continue the conversations that we started yesterday about environmental humanities and the way that they play out in North America and Europe and in Southeast Asia. So today I want to talk about something completely different from yesterday, which is this concept of multi-species studies and multi-species justice that has developed over the last 15 years. And so here's what I'd like to do in the talk today. So I'm going to start by talking about polar bears as an example of how different ideas of justice get trafficked sort of across the human more than human boundary. And in a sort of loose way, but to introduce you a little bit to the kind of topic and the kind of strands of argument that are being made in the field. In the second part, I'm going to become a little more technical and theoretical to explain, what multi-species justice really emerged from and what its definitions currently are. And then in the third part, I'm going to zero in on narrative forms and what narrative, and in particular fiction, might be able to do in helping us to imagine what the world looks like from the perspective of other species. So that's what we're going to cover. So I'm going to start with this image here, and you may have seen it or not, but if you haven't, you probably have seen images like it in reporting on climate change in recent years. These kinds of illustrations appear in discussions about how global warming affects our emotions, our outlook on life, our relations to others, and our expectations for the future. Issues that have become more and more prominent as global warming has become more visible. This particular illustration is by Annie Zhao, and it appeared in an article on climate despair, especially among young people, in the online magazine Vice in 2019. It shows a young person in a posture of dejection or depression, head cradled in the arms, wrapped around the knees, and this person is sitting on a melting ice floe, adrift among others in an Arctic landscape that is being transformed by climate change. So for a lot of audiences across the globe, it's an immediately recognizable allusion to the many pictures and illustrations from the last quarter century that show sad, starving, or desperate polar bears on similarly shrinking ice floes as cultural icons of climate change, including this very odd sort of animated image here that was actually in An Inconvenient Truth, the film by Davis Guggenheim and Al Gore from 2006 that brought climate change to the attention of the global public. The geographer Mike Hume, British geographer, already pointed out in 2009 that the typical stories about climate change, which he calls the lament for Eden, cast Earth's atmosphere as the last wild area on the planet, which is now being lost because of human-induced climate change. In that context, he says, the polar bear, that hackneyed icon of climate change, ends up not just worrying about its own survival, but is made to carry a huge additional weight on its shoulders, the weight of human nostalgia. Now, this was in 2009, so quite a while ago, he already called it a hackneyed icon. But yet, in 2019, it still is alluded to, it appears. This kind of lament has not disappeared, of course, but over the last decade and a half, the emphasis of public discourses about climate change has shifted to questions of geopolitical justice. So, who causes greenhouse gas emissions and who suffers the greatest consequences of climate change in the present, and transgenerational justice, how climate change will affect those who are now young and those who are yet to be born. These forms of justice have taken on increased prominence with youth activists and movements like Greta Thunberg, Elizabeth Wanjiru-Watuti, Extinction Rebellion, and the Green Generation Initiative, to name just a few of the many movements that have sprung up. To some extent, they've displaced the concern over non-human species that are affected by climate change. So polar bears as cultural icons may be past their prime, but that doesn't mean that their symbolism has stopped to resonate. So you often see images of protesters, especially young protesters, dressed up as polar bears. And those have become as much a staple of climate events as images of polar bears themselves. Activists belonging to Extinction Rebellion, Greenpeace, XR, and other organizations adopt these costumes to signal that young people and their futures are put at risk from global warming just as much as the prospects of non-human species. And they foreground the hypocrisy in lamenting the decline of polar bear populations, but not the diminished prospects of poor communities, communities of color, and cohorts of young people who are experiencing and will experience the most serious consequences of climate change over the next few decades. So these images are pretty familiar by now, but they're also interesting examples about how stories about environmental justice travel between humans and non-humans, and that's kind of what interests me about them. A parallel but different connection between the histories of humans and non-humans in the face of climate change emerges when you add to these common images indigenous perspectives on polar bears. Inuit individuals and communities with firsthand knowledge of polar bears and their habitats have been reluctant to accept the designation of bears as threatened or critically endangered. So the writer Roy Scranton, in an account of a voyage to the Arctic, reports that the Inuit elder Larry Odlaluk told travelers, "I want to dispel a notion about polar bears. I hear a lot about polar bears, a lot about what people down south think about polar bears." And down south is, of course, kind of everybody from the point of view of an Inuit community. "I want to tell you that polar bears are very healthy. There are very many polar bears, far too many of them. The ice hasn't affected our polar bears. The polar bear is just fine." Scranton interprets the statement as evidence of a conflict between global environmental concerns and local economics. European and North American conservationists want to preserve polar bears, he says, while Inuit are interested in preserving the income that they derive from hunting bears and using or selling their pelts. I think that's way too simple an explanation for what's going on here. And you get a much more complex narrative in a Inuit-made documentary called Inuit Kapirangajuk, Inuit Knowledge and Climate Change by Zacharias Kunuk and Ian Mauro from 2010. It's an hour-long documentary that features interviews with members of 4 Inuit communities in the Canadian Arctic. The film focuses on the interviewees' accounts of their experience of climate change. And with regard to polar bears, 2 narratives emerge, as you'll see in this clip that I want to play. So this is the film. Here's the next one.
Tamakua, Luyato, Luakoni Falaimata, Kamakayauni Kumini, Amalo. Tamakua, Kamakayauni Kumini, Tana Kamajimini, Tana Kuralu, Sugashu Rostu, Illualani Makuninga, Kamatoya Kundikisutuinan. Sugashu Tamakua, Kamakayauni Kumini. So I may see one of the Alumata, Nanu. Saimalu. Nanukilina Tausu Makwamani, Ukatatu Mary Tulimi, Tisili, Amisoklo Alu Lamata. Can we do not yet? Nanulima. At a Talisana to Tisakasu Matalimani, not in it.
Ima, Papa Yatalo, Namotu Nalu Artistud, Kalu Alectud. Tamanna actualo nanuin pilato no kadagon lang ito. Kalulano. Tisa kaya tiyo to sa mayunun. Tako katak sa mga ito nun. Uvakulli. Uva ja kotitinni. Kaujima juun.
Mana ukalauktua. Kapuktauraan kumenya sinik titaukottanung minyot. Siuti miiktiksoktaukottanung minyot. Aviuji joulu yuksaa simanya jakattang mikä missä raaktumun. Serukket juteerukit junit juklu. Ei jungit kappeasukut. Kappeasungit jutikilok junit juklu. Kadunangin lang natista mukwa. Kaya maikitaw na sugiyaka. Awal siko kawan nila kiruak madlo. Nanoy tayo ko si Jangit tayo kawan ni Malak Takarak.
Kung mangitain na doon, uwatin nun, umayro kunun, ilang ang katak si Mayuin, kasi nanayaw katak si Mayu. Tahan na sinikti tayo yung pulimigaw ko suti, biyong itim makayaro. Ulume nanuktak tayo kata. Nanoy tiki kadak tayo mo tam. Kanoy man, makatusayom na tuwin. Nipikang itim yung taro kami, tusayom na tuwin. Kulimigoring mo. Kulimigoring mo pila katak suting. Tusayom na ni kumun, kingain namin na angon na surukton. Nail luneo kisya na kisutuin na nunaring mo tikisakay lakton, naiman luneo kisya na angon na surakame. Takwa rin nanoy, nipikang itya mga itong pero kami, siyuting tusayom na sa atukulong mo ta. Pekwa si takaktok, so siyutin nga, tusama mo nga. Piminugo, unayaw roksune, kiduktaw roksune, annayaw ni kuwin, tabba, tayo may tugam, sadlo araw.
Jadi ko tayo na yaw katak to simut lang naraw sa katak sa batak kung asya ko tamo. Tayo ko pimid like to araw. Tayo ko simut ataw simut like to sa doktor da kapung yak to na ron na tami. Tayo na kung asya ko ta. Dan kung asya nga tayo na siya sa mga ang siyon na siya sa mga agluk metang min. Kung asya ko tayo lang dan ayo ko tigil katang ayo.
Suri mana sikurak suarang maman au jangan itu suri mana. Ukpere luang kita kalau teman nanong iman nyawa luang yang ninga. Angon asung ningil lu nanoi mana sokat jangan kalau teman kau je makoi lagi. Mana sokat aku yang emma aku sebenarnya ninga nanong nudlu sokat tu aku yang ni mana suri. Tapi macam.
Uwa nga, isumaro ginong itaga, taikwa, isumaro klaro, nanoy na video te karoak sotik, nanoy aksong na aktuaraktan. Nanoy awajak kun angusong naksaw kami, awajak ko kaksin naksaw katang mata. Imang may katigit niya mga islunig diyo natit, natok sa akin naksaw mata.
Kau yang mana orang tu, waktu tu. Nungular tu, pita kakun nilar. Teko kapat tu, mana sih paksa mati lunga. Tako lawas semang itaka, tako ya kalau semang itaka tahu semelun ni.
Teko lo nanong ni, damak kulinga at tao suktun, at tanak tumili tiga suktun lo. Kau limangin ni kumun, kaya metu tigi yakali. Nanuili, at tanak tumili nangin mata. Imanit takalo ako niya aro. At tanak tumili ko nangin mata. So kalmamak may utaw kami.
Sunak tujunga, sunak lagaro junga. Temak ko sunak ijaro ko na nukdati tayo may loktaw tilugin. Ikkay katak tunga, ninyo kalakta maukaw singan ni. Umayo na kanoy lokso, kamak tayo katakit, tukot jangin lugo. Chukay ma inuin nungur ukaw tiyaw katak ime tu atarnak tumelo mata. Piyo ko yaw tiyaw na po atarnak tumelo mata. Ini atarnak tumelo tutuyun nang ito. Kalau na pilih karena minun tuktunik nanong na kilalugar ni umayunik atarnak tumelo tutukatang mata. Tabba dan na atayu aruk tabba ni umayumi Taatsima uumayu piuyunneeru tikituineriaqattiarlunegu. Attarnartumiilertittirisiu qattammata ine pasisau qattaqungittiartakka attarnartumiilermata ikkua pijauttailelerle. Attarnartumiilertittiyunnangillaringmata ine pileriaqarunnagimmata inunni nagliksaartillegu.
So you see that there's sort of two different stories here, both of which to some extent contradict the established science about the polar bears. So the first one is that the polar bears are simply not endangered, but that they are on the contrary more numerous and more visible than they've ever been before. And you could explain that by pointing out that polar bears might simply be more visible around settlements because their food sources on sea ice become less accessible. But that would dismiss Inuit observers' ability to accurately observe ecological changes beyond their own immediate environments. The film shows quite clearly that hunters and fishermen among the Inuit often travel quite far from their homes and that they have extensive empirical knowledge of their region. And other interviewees indicate in a different narrative that they have witnessed signs of trouble, right? That the polar bears have died because of overdoses of tranquilizers administered by wildlife biologists, that their hearing has been damaged by helicopter noises, that some have drowned because of the tracking collars that they were fitted with as part of the monitoring efforts. And the idea there seems to be that they either can't stick their head into the holes to capture seals, into the breathing holes, or that they stick their heads in and then aren't able to pull them back and drown. So to the extent that polar bears are at risk, these interviewees claim the cause is the intervention of Southerners in general and wildlife biologists in particular, rather than changes in the bear's habitat. And these observations, as you can tell, are often combined with expressions of contempt for biologists whose knowledge in the interviewee's perspective is gleaned from labs and books and ignores the lived experience of Inuit people. And Rita Natchuk here at the end is quite clearly angry at outsiders who come in to lecture Inuit and interfere with their way of life. What resonates in these comments is resentment at scientists and environmentalists who, unawares or not, repeat colonial gestures that the Inuit communities have come to know and resist for generations. The imposition of political power, authority, and knowledge from outsiders without any interest in understanding and integrating that knowledge and lived experience, integrating local knowledge and lived experience into their own approaches. And here that sort of resonates with Dean Wilson's allusion to local knowledge and its integration into scientific approaches. You may or may not agree with the interviewee's assessment that the polar bears are not at risk. I, for one, do not, or that the only risk that they face is scientific monitoring. But it's clear that in this context, that conservation cannot succeed without awareness of the region's history and respect for the knowledge systems outside the natural sciences. Without, in other words, the understanding that polar bears are entangled in local histories and narratives of how the identities and ways of life of particular cultural communities have been changed by colonization and modernization. What this context also makes clear is that conservation is in many contexts a matter of justice. In this case, the entanglement of conservation with a history of colonial oppression. And that was sort of a little bit the argument that I made in the book, Imagining Extinction, that Professor Chu mentioned, that we focus on endangered charismatic megafauna that then comes to sort of stand in for all animal and plant species, that then proxies for biodiversity. And biodiversity, of course, has come to mean something positive, quite abstractly, something that we value about nature. And when you dig down into these stories, it leads back to the connection of these species that are valued to the community's experiences and changes through histories of modernization and colonization. So these are two quite different examples. So one is sort of mainstream European and North American in terms of these protesters who don polar bear suits. The other one is indigenous, of how stories of justice travel between and connect human and more than human communities. Let me now take that to a little bit more of a theoretical level to look at how the concept of multi-species justice arose in that context, what types of thought and activism it draws on, and what promises and what challenges it has. So multi-species justice has emerged over the last 15 years roughly, but in a certain sense, it relies on ideas that have much deeper historical roots in the environmental movement. So Aldo Leopold, a mid-20th century American environmentalist, in his book of nonfiction, The Sand County Almanac, which came out in 1949, envisioned the community of justice expanding from humans to other species in what he called the land ethic. So he says, all ethics so far evolved rest upon a single premise, that the individual is a member of a community of interdependent parts. The land ethic simply enlarges the boundaries of the community to include soils, waters, plants, and animals, or collectively, the land. In short, a land ethic changes the role of Homo sapiens from conqueror of the land community to plain member and citizen of it. Well said, but so what multi-species justice theorists over the last decade and a half have attempted to do is to think through the complications and paradoxes that arise when you expand the boundaries of the civic community beyond the human. Let me explain some of the milestones here. So Donna Haraway mentioned the term multi-species justice casually in her book When Species Meet in 2008, and emphasized multi-species environmental justice, as she called it, more insistently in her book Staying with the Trouble in 2016. But she never gave sort of a precise definition or theoretical account of the term in either book. The philosopher David Schlossberg proposed the term ecological justice in his 2007 book, Defining Environmental Justice. This book was really path-breaking, and I recommend it to all of you, because it redefined environmental justice as it had been theorized since the 1980s, which had focused mostly on distributive and participatory justice. Schlossberg proposes that environmental justice also needed to include recognition justice and capabilities justice. I'm not going to explain those here, happy to do that in the Q&A, but recognition justice is obviously what's at stake in what the Inuit say in Kapirungajuk. It's the recognition of knowledge systems other than Western science in the management of nature. So Schlossberg adds these dimensions to bring environmental justice up to date and into sync with other theories of justice. But he also adds them explicitly so as to find common ground between what he calls environmental justice and ecological justice. And ecological justice, in his account, means justice that extends beyond humans to other species and to the rights of nature itself. In other words, he wants to bring together the strands of environmentalism that are mostly focused on human health and well-being, and those that are mostly focused on the non-human world. That's not an easy thing to do because theories of justice are by and large based on John Rawls's theory of justice from the early 1970s. So that was a theory that has functioned as one of the most important foundations of justice thinking. And for Rawls, members of a community of justice can only be those who are full moral agents, who can reason about and participate in debates and decisions. But I don't know how many of you might be acquainted with Peter Singer's work on animal liberation. Singer argued that not all humans really qualify as full moral agents either, if you take those criteria. So the children, the elderly, or mentally differently able persons. And yet nobody would think of them as not subjects of justice. By the same token, elements of the natural world, in Schlossberg's argument, should not be excluded from claims to moral consideration just because they don't have moral agency in Rawls's sense. So engaging with these questions of recognition, Schlossberg argues that acknowledging what humans share with other elements of the ecological world helps to expand the community of justice to other living beings. Not, though, by making similarity to human as a precondition, but rather by focusing on what makes humans natural. These similarities include sentience, needs, interests, certain forms of agency in individual non-human creatures, and also autonomous integrity as a feature that characterizes both non-human organisms and ecological systems. And emphasis on capabilities, so the possibilities for flourishing or living a full life beyond just mere survival, also moves ecological justice beyond individual organisms to the habitats and systems that are necessary for their survival and thriving. So Schlossberg says capabilities include what is necessary for functioning and flourishing of human and non-human alike. It's an integral aspect of the living process. So a comprehensive theory of justice that includes capabilities can't limit itself to humans alone. That's his basic argument. So it's not an easy task to draw what a list of capabilities that are necessary for human functioning might look like. A basic inventory might include life, health, free movement, social bonds, and emotional, for example. It's even more complex to create this kind of inventory for animals, plants, and systems such as rivers or forests. Schlossberg concedes that this is difficult. Reasoning about justice here must draw on the logical science as well as other forms of in-depth knowledge of nature to translate capabilities justice into concrete actions. Now, this term ecological justice has not found widespread use, and I think this may be because for a lot of people, including myself, in a lot of contexts, environmental and ecological kind of mean the same. So let me add a few of the other sources for multi-species thinking. So my own engagement with it in imagining extinction came out of an attempt to think together environmental justice with multi-species ethnography as it had emerged around 2010. So multi-species ethnography was a new but not a unique idea at that point. It formed part of a broader spectrum of efforts in the early 21st century on the part of anthropologists, ethologists, geographers, and philosophers in Australia, Belgium, France, Italy, and the United States to integrate the study of human with non-human forms of cognition, behavior, and sociality. So this took a bunch of different terms that I've put on the slide here for you, not necessarily to remember them in detail, but just to see what the breadth of efforts was to think human and non-human together. So Lesser-Bonin and Desprez in Belgium and France used etho-ethnology or ethno-ethology as their terms. In the US, the urban planner Jennifer Walsh used trans-species theory to talk about mixed inhabitants of modern cities. In Italy, it was called zooanthropologia, and so forth. The term multi-species ethnography was proposed in 2010 by Evan Kirksey and Stefan Helmreich, two anthropologists, as a way of foregrounding the entanglement of human societies and cultures with many non-human species. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with the anthropologist Anna Singh's work on matsutake mushrooms, which is a good example of how to do that and how matsutake mushrooms get harvested and consumed across cultures and continents. So that multidisciplinary study of human and more than human socialities is now commonly referred to as multi-species studies, with multi-species justice a central term in that field. There are other sources that you could point to for this kind of thinking, indigenous and other non-Western cosmologies that have not traditionally relied on a categorical distinction between human and non-human lives. That's been a really important source of influence. Multi-species theory also draws on the various types of post-humanisms that were discussed starting in the 1990s, some of which, not all of which, but some of which were concerned with humans' relations to other species. And it was influenced by the various kinds of new materialisms that developed around the same time. Again, some strands focused on the animate and sometimes even inanimate natural world, not all kinds of material, but some of them. So what's the central agenda of multi-species justice? As the scholar Danielle Sellermeyer and her collaborators have emphasized, a basic democratic principle is that those affected by a policy or action should have a say in the decision-making process. But human decisions undemocratically exclude a wide range of the affected, by which this team means non-humans who are not usually considered part of political communities. And so they go on to argue that multi-species justice entails a critical stance vis-a-vis those characteristics that are to count as criteria for moral considerability as a subject of justice. Those traditionally preferred, like agency, subjectivity, and the capacity to critically reflect and think, turn out to be, not coincidentally, those associated with a human individual. multi-species justice insists on the need to account for other beings with their own radically diverse life projects, capacities, phenomenologies, ways of being, functionings, forms of integrity, and relationalities. Multi-species justice redesigns justice away from the fiction of individualist primacy toward an ecological reality where human and non-human animals, species, microbiomes, ecosystems, oceans, and rivers, and the relations among and across them are all subjects of justice. And that then in turn required a rethinking of what being human really means. I'm just gonna quickly put that on the slide here without going into detail on it. But so what multi-species theorists tend to push against is the idea that humans are physically separate or separable from other species of non-human nature, that humans are unique from all other species, and that humans therefore are more important than other species. So that's the theory. Envisioning what multi-species justice would look like in practice is, of course, an enormous undertaking, an ambitious project of rethinking humans in the context of other species. It involves the reinvention of political and legal procedures and institutions, all the way to the acknowledgement that justice itself is a term whose definitions and practices vary a great deal between cultures. And that variability, I think, is one of the big challenges for thinking about environmental ethics and about multi-species justice in particular. Some of you might be familiar with the Marxist geographer David Harvey, who already pointed out in the 1990s that justice is a term that has a great deal of political mobilizing power, a power that derives in part from the idea that considerations of justice introduce guiding principles with which you can then settle otherwise controversial political issues. And so he pointed out in Justice, Nature, and the Geography of Difference, to argue for a particular definition of social justice has always implied appeal to some higher order criteria to define which theory of social justice is more just than another. But that appeal to higher order criteria conflicts with the simultaneous recognition that justice is a socially constituted set of beliefs, discourses, sorry. So I'm going forward instead of backward here, just a second. Justice is a socially constituted set of beliefs, discourses, and institutionalizations expressive of social relations and contested configurations of power. So multi-species, that's just generally what he says about justice, and multi-species justice is not exempt from that conflict. On one hand, it wants to deliver or develop ethical principles that include more than human forms of ways of life. On the other hand, it also has to recognize that these principles are always bound to underlying assumptions that are specific to cultural communities. That's not a conflict that can be settled, I think, in any simple sense, but I think it can be acknowledged and negotiated. And it's not specific either to environmental or multi-species justice, but it's just a general issue with creating any system of cross-cultural ethics more generally. I'm sure all of you are aware that there have been recurring debates over human rights as either globally binding guidelines for the ethical treatment of individuals, or as principles that are excessively based on European ideas of rights and justice. So let me bring this down from the side theory to something a little more concrete. I think there's two types of scenarios that multi-species justice thinking typically engages with. So one concerns the choices and decisions that we make about particular human communities in relation to non-human species. How much money and effort do you invest in helping poor human communities, and how much in supporting animals and ecosystems? Cities in many parts of the world are confronted with choices about whether to create more parks and green space or to create more housing. In a different context, conflicts between the needs of humans and those of non-humans came up especially between the 1960s and 1990s with the creation of wildlife refuges and national parks in the global south. Often those were undertaken at the initiative of NGOs from the global north. And they were undertaken quite often at that point in time without consulting local communities and sometimes against their protest or resistance. For example, when the creation of national park prevented local communities from hunting or logging in ways that they had practiced for centuries. So against this kind of fortress conservation, as it has come to be called, most environmental organizations adopted participatory forms of conservation, starting in the 1990s, the so-called community conservation. But the question of, whose rights are recognized and who gets displaced by conservation efforts has not disappeared. So that's one set of problems that multi-species justice thinks about. How do you think about humans and not humans? The other set of problems that emerge in multi-species justice concern the interests of different non-human species and what comparative claims they have on our moral considerations. So to give an example, when the elephant population in the South African Kruger Rand Park, for example, swelled from 5,000 to 20,000 in 2008, park rangers suggested that a number of them have to be culled so as to preserve the plant vegetation. Animal welfare advocates, by contrast, argued that nothing could justify the killing of animals, especially highly intelligent vertebrates. But that, of course, then entails that plants are endangered and other species that depend on them. Similarly, in my hometown of Los Angeles, a debate raged for years about how to handle the population of between 800,000 and 2 million feral cats in the county. Environmentalists argued that a large number had to be killed because they kill butterflies, lizards, and birds, whereas cat lovers advocated for spay-neuter release policies. They won when the city council in 2022 adopted a no-kill policy. No kill, that is, for cats, but not for songbirds or reptiles on whom the feral cats do wreak havoc. So multi-species justice, like other theories of justice, does not generate principles that are independent from underlying cultural assumptions and values, but it does allow us to examine what those assumptions and values are. So to put it in a slightly different way, we could say that justice is a concept that allows us to look at human, more than human relations in a different way. It asks us to imagine that non-human beings are subjects of justice and to subject some of them, at least, to the same rules as humans are. How does that change the way in which we approach conservation, environmental crises? And that's sort of the really interesting question that I think multi-species justice wants to lead us to. And it's in that context that narratives, both fictional and non-fictional, and across different media, all the way from informal chats to newspaper reporting and feature films, take an important role in examining how multi-species communities currently work, and in imagining how they might work differently. So with that in mind, let me explore a little bit what tools narrative offers to explore these complicated challenges. So you have Sam J. Miller's novel Blackfish City from 2018, set in the fictional Arctic city of Qaanaaq. This novel features characters who are physically and psychologically bonded with orcas and polar bears via nanotechnology. And that signals the emergence of new bonds between humans and animals in the face of environmental crisis that go well beyond the familiar polar bear iconography. Sherry Tepper's The Family Tree reverses readers' ingrained assumptions about community of justice when people from a society 5,000 years into the future time travel to the 20th century. And it's only at the point when they actually confront humans in the 1980s and 90s that it becomes clear that they themselves are not actually humans, but the descendants of genetically engineered animals who have only experienced humans as animal-like tools of labor. Starhawk's novel, The Fifth Sacred Thing, pictures an ecotopian San Francisco in the year 2048, where non-humans are represented by humans and take part in decision-making in the city council. And there's a ton of science fiction novels that feature biotech animals with human-like intelligence. So science fiction broadly has offered a lot of perspectives on humans in their relation to non-humans. Beyond these portrayals of new kinds of bonds between humans and animals, other narratives deploy one of the most powerful strategies, telling a story from a non-human point of view. So the Canadian novelist Barbara Gowdy published The White Bone in 1999, a novel all of whose characters are African elephants living in a world of poaching and biodiversity loss, with elaborate social structures, cultural practices, and even in this case, religious beliefs. The French novelist Bernard Werber builds a story world equally populated by humans and ants in his 1990s trilogy, The Ants, The Day of the Ants, and The Revolution of the Ants. And he based that on in-depth research about the perception, communication, and social structures of ant societies. So it's a super interesting novels to read. How do you represent a species that doesn't rely on sight and sound so much as on touch and smell in human language? You know, in these novels, there are sort of two parallel mysteries, and the plot starts to converge when the humans and ants develop a technology of communication that converts sounds into pheromones and vice versa. He's more recently published a trilogy of novels on cats that narrates an increasingly violent human world from a feline point of view. Human civilization descends into anarchy, rats threaten to take over the world, and the cats eventually ally themselves with humans to combat the rats. So Gowdy and Werber depict animal societies and perspectives to develop alternative views of violence and justice. Animal poaching in Gowdy, pesticide use in Werber's ant trilogy, terrorism in his cat trilogy. One of the most accomplished narratives in this vein that not only develops the plot through animal eyes, but even features an animal narrator is the Martinican novelist Patrick Chamoiseau's Les 9 consciences du mal fini. So that's the nine consciences of the broad-winged hawk, which is narrated by a hawk and his gradual awakening to environmental crisis, especially pesticide impacts and climate change, through the guidance of an Antillean crescent hummingbird. So this is a brilliantly written novel, and as a bird watcher, of course, I adored it. And it has a very shattering description of how climate change and the disruption of migration patterns affects bird populations. So Gowdy, Werber, and Chamoiseau deploy animal societies and perspectives to develop alternative views of justice and what human societies might look like from that point of view. Types of violence and structural violence present themselves as inexplicable horrors to the animals that only gradually come to understand them, if at all. For the authors, the alienness of non-human species is not biological so much as epistemological. So their modes of perceiving, experiencing, and communicating about the contemporary world so different from the human that the narrative strategies of science fiction offer themselves, even when these books are not necessarily science fiction in the strict sense. Gowdy puts the emphasis on dystopia, so sociocultural as well as biological extinction as a consequence of human impact. Werber and Chamoiseau, by contrast, frame access to the alien perspective of animals as a hopeful way out of the dead ends of human sociality. Let me give a couple more examples before moving on. The Great Silence, a video installation by the Puerto Rico-based artists Ayora and Calzadilla, calls attention to a critically endangered bird species endemic to Puerto Rico, the Puerto Rican Amazon, or Cotorra puertorriqueña. So Amazona vittata is the name of the species. Here we go. Film images of the parrot, of a forested area, and of empty enclosures that evoke cages are accompanied by a text written by the Asian American writer Ted Chiang, which was subsequently published as a standalone short story in the journal Efflux. Sorry, I'm once again moving in the wrong direction here. And in his collection Exhalation in 2019. So this text too is a first-person narrative by a bird, a Puerto Rican Amazon addressed to humans, and that takes its point of departure from the Arecibo telescope that operated in Puerto Rico from 1963 until it collapsed in 2020. And it brings up this telescope to ask why humans search for alien life forms, but ignore the intelligent beings who surround them on their own planet. So the parrot says, this is a picture of the installation. And I was able to see that in Madrid a few years ago. The parrot here says, the humans use Arecibo to look for an extraterrestrial intelligence. They desire to make a connection is so strong that they've created an ear capable of hearing across the universe. But I and my fellow parrots are right here. Why aren't they interested in listening to our voices? We're a non-human species capable of communicating with them. Aren't we exactly what humans are looking for? The parrot's address revolves around the Fermi paradox, the question why, in an enormously vast universe with innumerable planets that should in principle be habitable, no signs of another intelligent species or alien civilizations have ever been detected. That's often called the Great Silence, right? Why should putative intelligence on other planets matter more to humans than the multifarious types of intelligence on planet Earth? Parrots, the narrator says, are more similar to humans than any extraterrestrial species will be, and humans can observe us up close. They can look us in the eye. How do they expect to recognize an alien intelligence, if all they can do is eavesdrop from 100 light years away? Narrator evokes the example of the African gray parrot Alex, who gained fame in animal cognition research for his ability to learn and use human language during his decades-long work with the ornithologist Irene Pepperberg. In contrast to Alex, the avian narrator in the video and story remains unnamed and ungendered. Its language is simple and lucid and doesn't really rely on any specifically avian modes of perception. Rather, this parrot narrator asks his audience to see human behavior from a non-human perspective. But it does make very broad claims about its own species' uses of language and narrative that go well beyond Pepperberg's research on Alex's cognition, and it hints at systems of meaning-making that humans are unaware of. So it says at one point, we Puerto Rican parrots have our own myths. They're simpler than human mythology, but I think humans would take pleasure from them. Alas, our myths are being lost as my species dies out. I doubt the humans will have deciphered our language before we're gone. So the extinction of my species doesn't just mean the loss of a group of birds. It's also the disappearance of our language, our rituals, our traditions. It's the silencing of our voice. So the great silence of interstellar space here turns into the great silence of terrestrial mass extinction. Chang puts emphasis here on the systems of culture, cognition, and communication that biodiversity loss entails. And he may imply a parallel between the loss of species here and the loss of indigenous languages and cultures. The parallels seem fairly obvious. So the futuristic narratives associated with extraterrestrial intelligence, at the same time, I diverted into the engagement with multi-species justice in the context of biodiversity conservation on Earth in the present. So it's a very cool use of science fiction tropes to really draw us back into current biodiversity needs. The 17-minute video in which Chang's text appeared in the form of subtitles shows no humans at all, though it does prominently feature human artifacts. Series of nearly still images show, on one hand, the Arecibo telescope in its technical and aesthetic detail, and on the other hand, the Puerto Rican forest, presumably the Rio Bajo forest that the narrator mentions as the parrot's habitat. The forest scenes include now and then images of large outdoor aviaries that may have been intended for the captive breeding of endangered birds. Puerto Rican Amazons themselves appear only in 2 image sequences toward the middle of the film, where subtitles highlight the parrot's cultural practices in what I just quoted. In conjunction, these images and the text suggest that humans have already found the planet and the life forms that their advanced space technologies are intended to detect. Earth, with its millions of non-human species, who speak to humans if they are willing to listen. While the avian narrator here holds out little hope for the survival of its species, it does seek to alert readers to the larger and mostly invisible mass extinction, whose worst consequences might yet be averted with greater human investment in multi-species justice. That's the implication of the narrative here. So there are a lot of other literary works and film works that have integrated animal and even plant perspectives as a new approach to environmental crisis, sometimes by way of individual animal characters, sometimes by way of entire animal societies. In nonfiction accounts, this is still very uncommon, although there has been a huge flood of publications for the general public on how climate crises are experienced by non-human organisms, an enormous general interest, I don't know if here, but certainly in Europe and in North America, in animal and plant cognition, communication, and sociality. So a different approach to realism in the portrayal of environmental crises is palpable even in these nonfiction works that are on this slide. So to conclude this discussion, I'd like to double back to the Arctic multi-species communities that I discussed at the beginning, but in a more fictional and playful vein. The video game, Never Alone, Kisima and Gitchuna, was released in 2014. It was released by Upper One Games in conjunction with the writer Ishmael Hope, a storyteller and poet of Tlingit and Inupiaq heritage, and the Cook Inlet Tribal Council. The plot of this video game is based on a traditional Inupiaq tale, Kunugiazuka, but the protagonist, who was traditionally a boy in the story, has here been changed to a young girl, Una, who goes through a series of adventures with her animal companion, Arctic fox, whom you see here. As a player, you have to change back and forth between the human and the non-human, and inhabit each character at different moments to conquer the challenges in the video game. Nuna and the fox are on a quest to determine the cause of unusually heavy and protracted blizzards that endanger her people. This turns out to be an ice giant who has to be defeated in the final boss battle. Those of you who play video games know what that means. It's the final big battle against the biggest enemy of all. And this is almost certainly an allusion to climate change. Along the way, Nuna and the fox find that their village has been burned down and robbed by a villain who looks white, almost certainly an allusion to the Arctic history of colonialism. In terms of the game, landscape itself poses the most constant challenges. Icy winds that blow Nuna off course, ice flows that need to be jumped, rickety-built structures that need to be navigated. Some of these challenges can only be overcome with the help of benevolent spirits that have these sort of vaguely animal or plant-like forms, so these white figures that kind of move for you on the screen. And they tend to help the human fox pair. And when a challenge has been overcome, the player is rewarded not with an additional weapon or ammunition, food, or a medical kit, which is kind of what you get in other video games. Instead, the player gains access to short documentaries that explain Inuit cultural practices, religious beliefs, and forms of sociality that inform the game world, many of which involve other species as kin and family. Other narrative devices also help to establish this real-world background. So at certain moments, the voice of an elder narrates some of the story, and at other moments, still shots show scenes in scrimshaw in what looks to, I think most of us, like a kind of graphic novel, but which is of course a common artistic form of narrative among the Inupiaq. Never Alone has won acclaim as one of the very few indigenous created video games. It combines factual knowledge of Inupiaq culture with a beautiful and compelling story world, but also one that is full of violence, wildness, and danger. In the very first segment, Nuna and the fox have to escape from a polar bear who hunts them. In a later one, they have to overcome the wiles of the little people, elusive gnome-like creatures who mean harm to humans. And some of the spirits pose a danger to Nuna rather than extending a helping hand, and fierce weather just remains a challenge throughout. So those are sort of the conditions in which the player has to win the game. And they might lead to what an average American player at any rate might experience as ludonarrative dissonance. This is a term that was coined by the game critic Clive Hawking in 2007, how in certain games, the conciliatory message that the narrative seeks to convey conflicts with the violent means that you have to employ to get to the ending. So you have to shoot zombies in a lot of video games, right, to get to an ending that then sort of purports to give you a conciliatory message. But that dissonance only arises from a culturally specific perception of nature as inherently harmonious and peaceful, That is not the Inupiaq understanding of nature, nor that of many other indigenous communities that do not sentimentalize ecology, but understand themselves to be a part of a fully living environment that includes certain forms of violence among its relations. Other forms of violence, such as that of the quasi-colonial villain who burns down Inupiaq villages, or the ice giant's interferences, disturb the living environment in a way that the player has to resist to succeed in the game, to reestablish justice in a sense. So Never Alone complements the print narratives that I've mentioned here with some of the distinctive narrative strategies of the video game as a medium, the ability to switch between two different characters, to integrate elements of sight and sound from different cultural traditions, and to make the player reflect on the plot's allegorical meanings, as well as the relationship between the gaming mechanisms and the progress of the plot. These strategies don't straightforwardly answer the questions that Multispecies asks any more than the print narratives do. But like experiments in seeing the world from an animal or plant point of view, they are a first step in imagining what multi-species diplomacy and democracy might look like, and what its uses might be in slowing down the rapid loss of animal and plant species that we're currently experiencing. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, please stay here, and then we will go straight to our Q&A session. So thanks a lot for this really rich and wonderful lecture. Can you all hear me from the back? And then this actually gives us a lot of things to think about, and also that highlights a lot of the topics that we've also mentioned in our class and in our environmental humanities course as well. So from the various kinds of forms of narratives that you highlighted, from textual forms of text, visual, and then also interactive ones like video games, and also a wide range of genres from sci-fi to realist kind of non-fictional kind of writing. It kind of makes me think about how multi-species narratives can actually work in various kinds of ways. Well, these are just quick comments, and then afterwards we'll try to open up the discussion. And then also, I think it's also a really wonderful way to start our conversation by focusing on the Arctic text, bringing us away from Singapore.
It is a very different ecological world,
but that's also something that maybe later on we can also come back to, because I think a lot of the discussions are also really relevant to what's happening in Singapore. And some of our friends here, we've talked about also about the birds, and also recently they have also reintroduced this killing of crows in Singapore.
I know, I've read about that,
And definitely that would be something that we want to know more about. And also that is also something we've that's also come across in your discussions on the tensions between the conservationists concerned about the preserving biodiversity versus the ones versus the animal rights activists and justice kind of discussions. So a lot of these are things that we would definitely would love to learn more. But before, I don't have a very clearly constructed question at the moment. But I want to really know whether there are any questions from the audience, from our students, as well as from also online. I think we have the YouTube one. Can I switch to next slide? Next slide. Okay. Okay. I see. Oops. Sorry.
Yeah, there are a few slides there that I'm going to bring up if necessary that are about actually plant narratives that would have made this talk impossibly long, so I left them out.
Right. So we have from the audience, from the online community who, if you have any questions, feel free to also raise them on Slido, and also for our audience here, if you would like to raise your questions via Slido, that's also okay. But we can start with any questions.
I have questions.
And please introduce yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Olga. I'm a PhD student at Hi. I'm Olga. I am a PhD student at NTU in the history department, doing a dissertation about post-extinct science and agriculture, working with a historian and sociologist. So I have two questions today. Thank you so much for your presentation about multispaces. I think often when we think about multispaces, we don't know where justice is coming from. So, and I think, this connection with people that read like sociological works would think while connecting multispaces with justice. So my first question is, do you think that multispaces justice be adopted in a legal frame in other countries? I was thinking about Ecuador, where someone asked about like the birds in Puerto Rico, because like since like 2008, they consider like nature not as a property, but really as an agent. And it's very much connected to the rights of nature, verified as Pachamama. So I was wondering if you think that this vision could be extended like to other countries, for example. And my second question is, how does AI change our perception with animals? Because on one side, people have the opportunity to read more about animals, to see images of animals, like to listen to the sound of animals. But are people more interested in animals? Are people willing to really go and see animals out in the nature, go to national parks? So it seems like there is a bit of a paradox between our relationships with animals, also due to the AI. Thanks so much.
Yeah. I have to watch out that I don't throw down this camera. So yeah, thank you for that. They're both great questions. So the answer to your first question is that this is already happening. So you pointed to the Constitution of Ecuador, which was rephrased in 2008 or reconfigured in 2008, and the same thing happened in Bolivia in 2009. And both of these constitutions tried to integrate sort of leftist, sort of post-Marxist ideas about the state with indigenous cosmovisions in Latin America. And both of them, indeed, as you indicated, attribute legal rights to the Mother Nature, the Madre Tierra, or Pachamama of indigenous cosmologies. Now, what exactly that means in legal terms is currently being worked out, right? Like who can sue on behalf of Mother Earth, and what, does a river have a right to a certain volume of water, or a forest a right to a certain number and diversity of trees, and so on and so forth, right? But it's not always working. I mean, there's still a lot of destruction going on in both of these countries, but it is an interesting legal precedent where actually there's a document that attributes legal rights to nature in general. In other countries, this has become more specific. So in New Zealand, there's a river that has been attributed legal rights. In Spain, there is a lagoon, a particular lagoon that has been given rights. And in various countries, there are changes in animal legislation. So what you're allowed to do with animals. I mean, there's still sort of blatant paradoxes and hypocrisies in this. Like in some states of the United States, there are extensive protections for pet animals, and cruelty against pet animals is strictly outlawed, but the same does not apply to farm animals who undergo far worse on a regular basis, right? So there's still a lot to think about, but that thinking, and I mean, especially also the use of primates in scientific experiments has been outlawed by various states, and there are states like Spain have attributed sort of quasi-human rights to some primate species. So these, I mean, they're all very incomplete and very, hesitant first steps, but they are being taken, which I think is a really encouraging sign. So I think that is actually one of the most important parts of it, is like how much of this can be translated into sort of constitutional and legal regulations. But in order to get there, in democratic countries, you need to have an electorate that is interested in that and elects the kind of people who will fight for that, right? So that's where the importance of literature sort of comes back. What was your second question? Sorry. Remind me.
About our relationship with animals, how has this changed with the AI? Because
Oh yeah, I have no idea yet. I mean, there are these interesting experiments underway where they're using AI to interpret and understand whale language. I'm actually going to a conference this coming fall in England where they're going to talk about what possibilities AI might open up for understanding other species. I'm super intrigued by this because I have as a pet bird a Jardine's parrot who is extremely talkative and often says very understandable human things that he's picked up from previous owners. He's sort of a rescue bird. And then other things that sound like he's saying something human, but I can't understand it. And one of my biologist colleagues at UCLA actually suggested to me, well, why don't you have him talk to Alexa and see if Alexa, the Google thing, if it can interpret what he's saying better than you can. I haven't tried that yet, and I don't think Alexa is smart enough to do it, but that those kinds of experiments are underway. And the other thing I've read about that people are interested in is whether huge aggregates of data about about animal behavior might be interpreted by AI in quite different ways than it is by human ethologists. So I think we're all only beginning to figure out how this might work and what AI might do.
I can just add on to that. Sorry. I just feel that AI seems to be changing a lot of our understanding of media narratives, and also I think it's a near future that we can definitely use AI in trying to help us in comprehending what animals are trying to how animals are trying to communicate with us. But for the more traditional kind of media that you've highlighted in your talk, for example, like video games or films, literature, etc. We are still relying on the human in trying to using our own human perceptions in understanding and trying to represent their kind of perspectives, right? So in many ways, it's still the kind of discussions on anthropomorphism and also anthropocentrism is still ongoing in a lot of these kind of multi-species narratives. And I'm curious to know how do we also try to whether there is really some ways in helping us in crossing the kind of, because say we try to understand the envelope of different animals, and in order to, I think some of these experimental filmmakers and others are trying to do that and trying to represent the kind of envelope of non-human beings. But then I also see the kind of limitations of that as well. I'm just curious to know whether in the text that you highlighted, whether you see it similar.
No, of course, that's an ongoing struggle that filmmakers and graphic novelists and science writers and science journalists have in translating what is essentially a non-human world of perception, cognition, and communication into human language or humanly understandable images. But I resist a little bit the idea that just because it isn't human language, it is therefore necessarily anthropocentric. I don't think it necessarily is, or only to the extent that we need to use that as a medium and that humans are the obvious audience for these works. But it is a little bit like the German philosopher Martin Gorky, who's actually written very eloquently about biodiversity extinction, biodiversity loss. He says, well, you can make the argument that whether we attribute value or not to certain animal or plant species, in either case, it's still humans attributing the value. True, in that sense, it's always anthropocentric, but the consequences are totally different for the others, for the plants and animals, depending on whether you're, egoistic or altruistic, if you want to use that language, right? So it's not the same. It's not just because it is humanly attributed value, or in the example that you brought, because it's human language, that therefore it makes no difference. No, it actually does. So I would anthropomorphism, sure, up to a point. Anthropocentrism, not necessarily. That's kind of how I would cut it.
Thank you, Professor, for the inspiring.
Speak to both, yeah.
For the inspiring. My question is kind of similar to the former question. So nowadays we are seeing a number of robotic animals, such as the Boston Dynamics and AI companion pets made by Sony, whose design, narrative, and purpose remain authored by humans. So I'm wondering, could they function as allies of multi-species justice, since they can replace some labor work of true animals, and also expand our imaginative repertoire of what counts as life, relation, or moral consideration? Or do they risk becoming the opposite, that entrenches anthropocentrism?
Yeah, I think, I mean, the sort of the use of robotic animals that I'm aware of is mostly serve as replacement companions for the elderly, right? That's done a lot in Japan, and those kinds of things. I'd be curious about what you mean by robotic animals replacing labor. I'm aware of what the examples of that would be, but I think it's honestly, I think it's mostly unrelated to real animals, because I mean, these robotic animals, the ones that I've seen, like the Sony created electronic dogs and such. I mean, the interaction is nothing like the interaction with a real live animal, right? So there are replacements, and I think there's upsides and downsides to it. I mean, in certain cases, I think this might be a good replacement when somebody really is not able to take proper care of a live animal in a sort of pet context, right? But once you still have that companionship, then I think this is actually not a bad solution. In other cases, it might be a distraction from the diminishment of the natural world that's going on around us. I mean, but that's not just robots, right? I mean, people have made that argument about nature documentaries in general, that we have such a profusion of images of animals that they kind of make us not realize just how much the real others, real plants and animals have been reduced in their habitat, diminished in their number, diminished in their diversity. Does that sort of make sense? What example were you thinking about in terms of labor?
It's like some working dogs. They need to go to some dangerous places and like save humans. But later we have like Boston Dynamics, the robotic animals, the robotic dogs. They can do the work of real dogs.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually great, because I mean, I've never envied the dogs that have to do that work of either sniffing out drugs or sniffing out people in the ruins of earthquakes and things like that. I mean, the training that these dogs get put through is incredibly stringent. So it's a hard life, and if that can be taken up by something else, by something mechanical, I wouldn't think that was necessarily a bad idea.
Thank you.
But you could convince me otherwise if you think that the dogs are actually happy doing that work. And it's
Our colleagues, scientists at NTU are also working on like robotic cockroaches to detect life form in these kind of disasters.
Cockroaches?
Cockroaches, yeah, just to detect whether they are
I would love to learn more about it.
We have a question over there. Well, okay, maybe after. There's also a question.
Oh, do you also need this one, maybe? Thank you.
I am active history of I put this about 14 years ago. I was able to defend housing and there July was say that imagine what is species justice before I went my very thousand you. Then I found that I was always under invasion attacked by a lot of cockroaches, ants. I didn't really accept them anymore. What is justice with the cockroaches and ants? That's impossible. So we have to talk about polar bears. Bears are very key, very key.
They're charismatic, yeah, they're charismatic.
And it was sometimes understood in very much for warfare or eccentric ones. They are showing, people are showing the costumes of the polar bear as gesture for. But that's again, it's environmental changes. Here, when we think about the harmful insects, the members are correlated from multi-species justice with approaches. I'm trying to this is the mind thing. So two is that the Darwinism and the more stronger history that ideas it actually is integrated with the social studies what provides. When we think about the social organization, in that obviously come up with social Darwinism. How our society can be shaped according to the Darwinian principles. Whether human beings are learning lessons from nature or not. And the multi-species justice actually the other way around. How our humans, ethics, can be relevant to ethics of living with other species. That's zero. That sounds like an idea that you are talking about, despite your case that anthropocentric understanding is actually not very good. So that was my second question. So how can we make sense of the multi-species justice with Darwinism? That was my second question. First question is about what the justice with justice.
Yeah, it's interesting how cockroaches keep coming up. I lived in New York City for 11 years and had a lot of cockroaches in my apartment as well. And at one point I discovered that they were coming from a window blind that was rolled up and that I put on top of a kitchen cupboard. And the cockroaches had just made that into their habitat. So there were like hundreds of young cockroaches. That were coming out of that. And yeah, at a certain point, you can't tolerate that where you eat it, where you cook, obviously. So I turned on the shower and put the blind under the shower. But I have to admit, I felt bad about it. I felt guilty about it because it's like, okay, these cockroaches were born in this apartment. I was not. And they like my food, and I inflict the death penalty on them for that, right? That somehow does not seem super fair, but there's also no real alternative to that. But I think that's very different. I mean, cockroaches were also all over New York City. And the question is, excluding a particular species from a particular space, I think is completely compatible with multi-species justice. And of course, you could ask questions about multi-species justice with regard to the COVID virus, right? Of course, we're going to try and kill it and eliminate it to the extent that it threatens our health, or that it even threatens our lives. I don't think that a multi-species theorist really has a problem that. But the question is, can we develop a relationship with cockroaches where we grant that they also have a space and that they have a function and that they belong into our ecosystem in the large sense, even if perhaps they don't belong in the ecosystem of our kitchen. And I think those are not sort of the most urgent problems, but they do come up when you think about urban planning and architecture. So I've thought a lot about multi-species architecture and talked to urban planners and architects and landscape architects in recent years about how we can, in cities, make buildings that are habitat for both humans and non-humans, as a lot of old farmhouses and barns and such, of course, used to be. And at UCLA, for example, we have one building where cliff swallows come every spring and they build these gourd-shaped clay nests sort of in the details of the architecture. And everybody's kind of happy with that, except for the people who don't like the bird poop that then comes down, right? And that's always, in cities, that's a question where you have to then, that was sort of the first problem that I think multi-species justice, or set of problems that multi-species justice always has to sort of deal with. How do you find a compromise between the claim of non-human species of our moral consideration and then people's cultural preferences? And some of this you can address through education, saying, no, maybe, you don't kill every spider that you find, just put them back outside. But there are a lot of people who are very spider phobic too, another non-charismatic species, right? That a lot of people just don't want around. And for that matter, a lot of people don't want birds around that are maybe noisy or that that we poop behind. I mean, in New York City, we've had big fights over the peregrine falcons that hunt down pigeons and then leave bloody pigeon corpses on the sidewalk on Fifth Avenue. You know, I mean, so you have to find that that's exactly, I think, what multi-species justice makes you think about. So where do we want to draw limits for humans? Where do we want to draw limits for non-humans? I think those are questions that you can't simply settle. And I think cockroaches are one part of that, but a much bigger and more important part of that to me would be farm animals. It's happening to species that are going extinct because of habitat loss. As to your second question, so I'm not totally sure which kind of Darwinism I mean, Darwin obviously has been used for social thinking in a variety of different ways. And in the 19th century was interpreted to be just about, the rights of the most powerful and the rights of the fittest, which arguably is a total misunderstanding because of Darwin and certain apology. So I'm not quite sure what specifically you clarified, what kind of Darwinism you're thinking about. I mean, multi-species justice, I should be clear, does not mean a non-viable, right? That's kind of what interested me about the video game, and it interests me about indigenous approaches to nature in general. They're not non-viable. It's not that indigenous vegetarian or it's with all kinds of violence, but violence is approached in a different way. Is that what you're talking about? Or?
In a sense, with one interpretation of nature is ready to control, therefore violence is always out there, and even we expect violence in human society can not be part of the nature that we have acknowledged. And the example of this, there shouldn't be any need for multi-species justice because humans are superior, and therefore it is a right of the humans to control colonize even externally.
Yeah, okay, so that's exactly the thinking that multi-species justice contests, right? And I think that's also an interpretation of Darwin that was very common in the late 19th century with Herbert Spencer and people like that, but that I think has gone by the wayside in the 20th century. And I think justice thinking in general, never mind multi-species justice, is precisely not thinking that the strongest or the fittest is the one that has the only right to survive. So I think that's a much larger question about if you want to entertain any concept of justice. So I want to say something else. And the idea that humans are somehow superior is exactly, of course, I mean, that's not the idea that all human societies have. That is a particular cultural idea. And again, you know, the human societies like indigenous communities that think of themselves as being part of a network of ecological relations, think of certain animal species as kin, in a way that actually takes away precisely that thinking that humans are somehow by definition different from and superior to everything else. I mean, that's precisely, I mean, that was not Darwin's idea either, right? Let's be clear about that, very clear about the fact that humans are a product of contingent evolution, just as much as other animals, and it was Victorian society that to be, that humans are somehow at the top of the evolution. Does that make sense?
Yeah, this Darwin thought that he was just one of the branches evolution see the branch was this is but the I'm not really sure still
Yeah.
why essentially non-actual centric point of view.
Thank you, Professor Park's question. And I'm aware that we are running out of time, but yeah, I mean,
should we take some of the?
Yeah, so I guess the last two questions are related to what we've already been discussing, and I do think that extending the idea of multispecies justice to what we consider as pests like cockroaches or rats in the cat trilogy that you've mentioned are actually a bit challenging at the moment. And also Hopper, the recent animation that I've seen Pixar, they make the villain butterflies, which is the tiniest and least powerful kind of a character as the villain. Right? So I guess it's still a bit of a challenge to consider all kinds of species.
Yeah, but I mean, I think the first thing that undoubtedly it is, and there's no, I mean, I was not suggesting that this offers an easy solution to that. But the first thing that multi-species justice theorists would point to is that the very notion of pest or weed is already a cultural one. It's making a category of certain types of animals, certain types of plants, and saying these are the ones that we don't want. And sometimes that has reasonable either public health or ecological reasons. Many other cases it does not. And I mean, in California, often, you know, the plants that get discarded as weeds are precisely the native plants that have been there because they're not as beautiful as what people want in their gardens, right? So it's in many ways a very, very arbitrary kind of distinction. So you want to distinguish between the cases where, you know, this can actually be founded on something other than just bias, and those cases where it's not possible. So pests and weed is already, you know, those are cultural constructs, and not necessarily ecological.
Thank you, Professor Heise. Because of the time, I guess we will continue with this conversation afterwards. And also, please join me in thanking Professor Park. Yeah, please feel free to. Thank you. Thank you, efforts.
Oh, we didn't get around any of these questions.
Students taking the course activity now time to define it. I think I would.
The last one, I mean, I think that's a recent person. We've already, you can combat